Thank you very much. Kaya, welcome. I'm talking to you at 2 a.m. here from Burulu on Wajak Noongar Boodja, the land of the Wajak Noongar people. You might know this place as Perth, Western Australia. I want to pay my respects to the elders of the Wajak Noongar people, past, present, and emerging. But as my research is actually on the Wadandi Noongar Boodja, the home of the saltwater people, I want to also pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm a heritage practitioner. I should start with that. I'm a heritage practitioner. Sound and acoustics is a small part of my heritage journey, but it's become an absolutely fascinating one for me. And I started researching the colonial cultural heritage of the southwest of Western Australia about 20 years ago, looking into the rich historic archives for the period. And that map there shows you the southern part of Western Australia, from Margaret River down to Augusta as my study area. And the questions I wanted to ask myself at that time were whether the places that we choose to assess and protect and conserve through heritage listings are the same as those places that were valued by people in the past. And following on from that, whether the values that people in the past had for their special places are the same values that we hold for them today. My study area was this area called the Shire of Augusta Margaret River. And I looked at the period from the first colonial settlement in the early 1830s to the time that the timber industry expanded in the area in the 1880s, which changed both the landscape and the soundscape dramatically. My research was done within the context of the strong primary frame that guides cultural heritage practice across Australia. That's founded on the principles in the Australia ICOMOS Borough Charter. And that sets out 5 criteria for assessing cultural heritage, which are aesthetic, historic, scientific, social, and spiritual value. Aesthetic value is multisensory, according to the Borough Charter, so all the senses should be considered when it's evaluated. Social value relates to the values that communities have for places. And sometimes that has an aesthetic dimension as well. So social value can also be multisensory. Unfortunately, the term aesthetic value remains, in Australia at least, strongly associated with the visual qualities of places. And so other sensory dimensions of heritage are actually very rarely identified or considered when thinking about management. Looking at the multisensory nature of aesthetic value led me to the work of F. Murray Schafer and his concept of the soundscape, which at the time I started doing my work was just beginning to become known in Australia. For this paper, I wanted to go back and revisit the historic acoustic landscape in my study area and look at it in a more sort of general, less place-based way in some respects. And I also wanted to look at whether sound and acoustic values are now being recognised and included in heritage listings and management strategies for the places that I identified as important. The town of Augusta was established in 1830, 3 years after the founding of the Swan River Colony, which later became Western Australia. And it was the first settlement in my study area. It initially comprised about 50 people, colonists and their families, together with their indentured servants and their families, and a small detachment of 15 troops with their families. There were quite a lot of young children in all of that. Despite very high hopes for the settlement, it actually struggled, largely because they underestimated the challenges of clearing the very tall timber, and because of the associated misconception that tall, dense forests indicated rich soils. Actually, the soils in this area are lacking in essential minerals that made farming very, very challenging. Although a small number of settlers arrived in the following years, by 1836, Augusta had actually begun to decline as people moved north, where the forest was more open and there was richer alluvial soil to support farming. But for a short time, it was at this period anyway, it was a small, lively enclave in the forest with a rich soundscape filled with meaning. Although the houses at Augusta were widely separated, the place would have been filled with sound. Most dominant would have been the general sounds of establishing the settlement and setting up farms. Clearing the land was hard work. And this image here was painted in 1836 by one of the early settlers, and you can see their attempts at clearing the land there, taking out the large timber. The sound of chopping and processing timber and building houses and other structures dominated in those early years. Only one settler brought out a flat-packed house with them. Everything had to be built from scratch. After that, there were the sounds of manual labor working the land. And all of these sounds were really important to the settlers, to the colonists, because they represented the industry, their industry, and the progress of the settlement. Despite the very modest size of Augusta and its population, for some people, the soundscape of Augusta was enough to define it as a town, with the implication that it was somewhat noisy, because there's a record in the archive about it being compared to the quiet of the surrounding forest, indicating there was, even in this early stage, a really clear understanding of anthropogenic sound and its impact. This is another early painting of Augusta slightly later by the same artist. Typical of the sound of settler voices was not localized just or constrained to the homesteads and settlements, extended far out into the surrounding landscape, which was very sparsely populated at that time by the Wadandi people. Colonists, including women, were highly mobile, typically in groups. The archives record people constantly moving between each other's homes and farms for practical and social reasons, as well as traveling to more distant outposts and other settlements. Travel occurred at all times of day and night. Travel was mostly on foot. There were no roads, and people didn't travel by horse at this time. So it allowed for conversation. And when people traveled by boat, you can see a small boat in the image there, they often, read aloud to each other to pass the time. So the sound of human voices really ran like ribbons through this landscape. Typical of small settlements, Augusta had no civic or commercial infrastructure, so people's homes provided a range of services and functions. And there were many observations in the archives about the sounds of social and cultural activities. I like this image particularly because it indicates that there are some visitors staying in the tents surrounding this house. The elegant occupations, as they were referred to in some of the letters, of music and dancing were particularly important to several families, and diary entries record that dancing often lasted well into the night and even the early morning, particularly in the home of the Turners and the Bussells, who were notable local families. Music and dance were a particularly important part of entertaining the intermittent visitors to the settlement, such as the crews of American whalers and supply ships. So there would have been other accents in this landscape as well, not just from the United Kingdom. Music and the sounds of people socializing would therefore have regularly drifted through the settlement. Nothing remains of the homes of these early colonists at Augusta except scattered ruins. All of the sites, however, still have meaning for the community, and they're listed on local heritage lists, but the values that have been recorded for these places don't actually include the historic community's values, and certainly don't reference any part of their acoustic values at all. In the second half of my study period, two key outposts were established by Alfred and Ellen Bussell, Allensbrook, which is in this image here, in 1854, and later Wallcliffe House in 1865, further north. The two homesteads were established between the new settlement of Busselton to the north and the old settlement of Augusta to the south. Like the houses at Augusta, these places served the same social and civic functions. However, because of their location, there were many more regular visitors as people travelled between Busselton and Augusta. So the archives have many records of large groups of people being hosted by the Bussell family, people travelling for social, business, or official business. At Augusta, the archives record that, as at Augusta, the archives record these visits were often accompanied by music and dancing. Unlike the farming ventures at Augusta, Ellensbrook and Wallcliffe were commercially very successful, and the large Bussell family ran herds of cattle between the two properties for many years. The Bussells had 5 daughters who worked on the property, including driving the cattle, so the voices of women, young women, would have been a recurrent feature along with these large herds of lowing cattle. There was some low-key tourism going on at this early period as well. The calcified tracts of tree roots in the shifting sands at Borenup Sand Patch next to the pounding ocean created a sublime landscape that appealed to Victorian aesthetics, making it a popular place to take visitors. It was also a place for quiet contemplation. One of the Bussell girls visited this area regularly. Her marriage was unhappy, and she found solace in the isolation where she could listen to the restless, triumphant music of the bubbling, ambitious sea. Tragically, Wallcliffe was destroyed in a fire in 2011, and Ellensbrook only narrowly escaped the same fate. Although it has a statutory heritage listing, there's no recognition in its citation of any acoustic values, and the Borenup Sand Patch has no heritage listings at all. Ellenbrook and the Borenup Sand Patch lie within the Lewin Naturalist National Park, a celebrated tourist destination that runs from between the 2 capes in the map I showed you earlier. It receives the highest visitation of all national parks in Western Australia. The 2015 management plan for the park encouragingly proposes including the remainder of the Borenup Sand Patch in the national park, but the values of the place still have not been clearly articulated. While the plan includes management strategies to protect the natural, physical, and visual qualities of the park, there's no reference to its acoustic qualities or any recognition of the multisensory nature of places and landscapes. In fact, the words sound, noise, and acoustic are not mentioned at all in the plan. Ellensbrook and the Borenup Sand Patch are both surrounded by relatively untouched native vegetation, and therefore their landscape context is very similar to the colonial context. This affords important interpretive opportunities for visitors who can gain a sense of what these places were actually like in the past. Droving cattle is no longer permitted within any national park, and there is no farming at Ellensbrook. It sits in this rather sterile greensward shown in the image. Nevertheless, the largely quiet natural landscape with its absence of modern anthropogenic sounds represents an important soundscape that is relatively authentic in terms of its colonial past, which should be recognised and more actively managed. Going back to Borenup, there's been sand mining on the eastern side inland from this image quite a way, but it's had minimal impact on the site overall. What's concerning, however, is that Borenup Beach, which you can see in this picture, is one of the few locations in the national park where beach driving is permitted. The plan acknowledges that this can impact, and I quote, the remote qualities, and that's about as far as the plan gets to actually referencing acoustic values at all, and the impact of anthropogenic sound. But as there's been no assessment of the acoustic or any other values of the Borenup Sand Patch, the impact of beach driving at this location hasn't been considered and is therefore not being managed appropriately. Visitor numbers to the Lewin Naturalist National Park are projected to increase, and the management plan notes that in some parts it may have already reached carrying capacity, and they're looking at actively managing that. Again, there are inferences to the impact of the noise of large groups of people camping. I believe it's important that future planning starts to engage more directly with acoustic values of places in this landscape and its soundscape more generally to develop better informed management strategies going forward. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Penny. That's perfect timing. Do we have any questions from Zoom or the room? Any comments? We have 5 more minutes. Yes.
Good day. Perth, one of my favorite cities. I was there a couple of years ago. Fascinating talk. Thank you very much. You've discovered all these sounds and soundscapes of the area, which I must go and visit. Have you made any attempt to reconstruct any of those soundscapes as part of a visitor attraction, for example? That's something I'm engaged in, I should say.
No, that's my role in the heritage industry has been more about the assessment of places and actually getting them protected through statutory processes. So I haven't really been able to explore the idea of interpretation. I think in Western Australia generally, acoustic interpretation is still in its infancy. A bit. So I think we've got a little way to go, and I'm not sure that it's the most obvious thing for people in terms of thinking about interpretation. We're still a bit stuck in the plaques era of interpretation, which I think misses all sorts of opportunities. You're welcome.
Yes.